The wind outside hasn't stopped screaming in 6 hours. Inside the cave, there's no light except the last orange coal of a dying fire. 12 bodies are pressed into a single pile under one massive bearskin, shoulder to shoulder, skin against skin, breathing in rhythm. Nobody is sleeping alone tonight. Solitude is a death sentence. Outside, it's -40. Inside, it's the only thing standing between this family and extinction. This wasn't a bad night. This was Tuesday. For 20,000 years, this was every night. Welcome back to Stikilo, where we dig into the raw, uncomfortable truths of what actually kept our species alive. 5 completely different human species lived through the Ice Age. 5 completely different continents, 5 completely different survival strategies, genetic mutations, bone architecture, tailored clothing, weapon design, and every single one of them arrived at the exact same secret. Here's what most people assume: that humanity survived the Ice Age because we were tough, smart, resourceful, that fire and tools and raw willpower dragged us through. That's not what the evidence says. The evidence says we survived because we refused to be alone. Every strategy on this list, the genetics, the architecture, the clothing, the art, all of it was really one thing wearing 5 different disguises: proximity, closeness, connection as a survival technology. Let's prove it. The first clue is buried with the Neanderthals, Ice Age Europe. For decades, pop culture painted them as dim-witted brutes. That's a myth. Neanderthals were built for this world, broad-chested, thick-boned, packed with muscle. According to Allen's rule, animals in cold climates evolve shorter limbs and stockier frames to retain heat. Neanderthals were a textbook case. They hunted Ice Age megafauna at close range, hand to hand, but their clothing was primitive, just heavy drapes of hide, no tailoring. So how did they survive nights that dropped to 40 below? They didn't survive it with technology, they survived it with each other. Whole extended families packed into a single overlapping pile under one hide, generating heat as a group. 16 hours of darkness every single night, spent that close to another human being. It wasn't a workaround, it was the entire strategy. But physical heat couldn't solve the oxygen starvation of the Tibetan plateau. That required something much deeper. We didn't even know the Denisovans existed until researchers found a single pinky bone in a Siberian cave. But their survival trick is remarkable. They conquered the Tibetan plateau, one of the most oxygen-starved, freezing environments on Earth, through a mutation in a gene called EPAS1 that let their blood process oxygen at extreme altitude without thickening into sludge. But genetics alone doesn't explain how that mutation ended up in millions of people alive today who aren't Denisovans. Interbreeding does. When Denisovans crossed paths with Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens out in that frozen wilderness, the populations didn't just coexist, they merged. DNA evidence confirms it. High-altitude populations today still carry that exact gene, a 30,000-year-old handshake still running in living bloodlines. Closeness didn't just keep individuals warm, it kept entire genetic advantages alive. Yet, out on the flat, wind-blasted tundra of Eastern Europe, modern-day Ukraine and the Czech Republic, there were no caves to hide in. This forced the Gravettians into a different kind of closeness. So the Gravettians built their own, out of woolly mammoth bones. Interlocking skulls as foundations, tusks arched into roofs, hides stitched over the top. A fortress made from the animal that had almost killed them. Inside those bone domes, they practiced polyphasic sleep, waking in the dead of night, stoking the fire, and using that wakeful hour as the center of tribal life. This is where the Venus figurines were carved, stylized human forms, likely tied to fertility and continuity, made by firelight while a blizzard raged outside. Look at the psychological shift here. Survival is no longer happening in spite of the group. The group is the shelter now. They didn't just build a structure to keep the cold out, they built a structure to keep each other in. Once survival stopped requiring constant physical friction, the Magdalenians of Western Europe evolved the concept. If the Gravettians were the architects, these were the tailors. They invented the eyed bone needle, and clothing stopped being a blanket and became fitted gear. Soft fur against the skin to trap heat, tough reindeer hide layered outside to block wind. Functional thermal wear 15,000 years before it had a brand name. But here's the part that matters. Because their clothing finally worked, they had time. Time they didn't have to spend simply staying alive. And what did they do with that newly won time? They walked into the absolute darkness of limestone caves, together, and painted masterpieces on the walls. Lascaux, the Sistine Chapel of the Ice Age. The moment survival stopped requiring constant physical closeness, humans invented culture, a new, less literal way of staying connected. This same invisible tether eventually crossed oceans, North America. Ancestors crossing the Bering Land Bridge, walking directly into a wall of glacial ice thousands of miles wide. Their survival ran on mobility and the Clovis point, a razor-engineered spearhead built to bring down mastodons. But a lone hunter with a sharp spear doesn't cross two continents. A tribe does. Tracking herds together, sharing kills, moving as one unit through hostile, unmapped land. Their survival was never about individual bravery. It was about never letting the group fracture, mile after frozen mile. So here's the thread running under all 5 of these. Neanderthals survived through physical closeness. Denisovans survived through genetic merging. Gravettians built architecture specifically to hold groups together. Magdalenians used surplus safety to build shared culture. Clovis hunters crossed a continent because the tribe refused to split. 5 species, 5 strategies, 1 answer every time. It was never really the fire or the tools or the fur that kept humanity alive through the Ice Age. It was refusing to face the cold alone. And that mechanism didn't end when the ice melted. It's the same reason isolation still wrecks people today, and the same reason the hardest winters of your own life were survivable, mostly because someone else was in the room. We didn't outgrow this, we just stopped noticing it. Right now, wherever you're watching this, you are warm. You have walls, heat, glass between you and the wind. None of that is why you're alive. You're alive because 30,000 years ago, in the dark, someone refused to let go. One question before you go. If the room went dark and the temperature dropped tonight, is there someone you'd actually want pressed in next to you? Or would you find out you've been more alone than you thought? Because that exact same psychological fear of isolation is what drove humanity to make the darkest mistake in our history. Click the video on screen to see what happened when we took survival too far.